Thank you, Charles, and good evening. In thinking about the idea of architecture and modernism, Charles really did set me thinking, because I'd never really considered my work in such a way. I'd seen it more in a way as a byproduct of the idea of minimalism, that through the process of extraction and reduction, of trying to search for the most essential part of an idea of a project. And I'd like this evening to talk through a number of past projects and examine the sort of essential idea that tends to lie within each of those projects. But before doing that, however, the slide on the left, or the image on the left, is really this idea of cataloguing. So as most architects, I imagine, we collect images of buildings, and I grew up in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, sort of Northcote, Carlton, Brunswick, and I've collected quite a few images of buildings, but not just of buildings themselves, but of particular moments that lie within the building, or perhaps a sense of space or an image, something that I find is of meaning and that reveals a certain nuance. So what I'd like to do before talking about the project is going through a number of these images and just talking about what I see in them. And some of them are outwardly quite ordinary, but beyond that, they have a certain weight and a certain beauty, and I think also a certain poetry within. So I'd like to just start with a number of these. So this is a project that I would often return to, a building from the 1920s in Rathdown Street in Carlton. It has sort of a builderly quality, but it sort of sits very determinedly on the street with a lovely sort of proportion. This little building in Northcote, just under the hill at Ruckers, at the base of Ruckers Hill, and there's something just about this building where you just read the concrete slab running through here, and at the top as well, where the roof is, just bringing a sense of protection to the building, and sort of rather unassuming way it just sort of turns a corner. And in Abbotsford, once again, this sort of rather unassuming building turns a corner, but the shop here activates the street, and the residence above just appears to set back slightly, so it creates a lovely sort of scale and presence to the street. This is a particularly dear building to me. This is a Christian Science building at the top of the hill in Northcote, and dates from the early 1960s. And so there's, not only do I find the composition really engaging and a sense of the materials, even the way the sign sits and the tiles, but in particular in here, the shelter that creates that shade in here, and then there's just a gap at the back, so the sunlight comes behind that, hits the wall and sort of activates that space. And then beyond that, there's this kind of alluring little staircase that takes you up at the back. And so somehow the sum of all of these parts give it sort of a reverberating quality that I sort of somehow always return to. This is in North Melbourne, where the top of a garage becomes a balcony. Or in David Street in Carlton, just near my office, where, you know, this original Victorian building, someone rather sort of perhaps unassumingly built a brick wall and a garage door, but somehow there's a space that's then created between this wall and the building, and it sort of has this suspended quality that adds something more to the whole composition. In North Carlton, this is in a way a sort of motif that I return to, this singular stair, but the doors open and you look through here behind a shop leading you up to a house beyond, and it's such an inviting sort of indication of sort of what might be to come. And this almost Geoffrey Smart-like composition of a building in Cardigan Street in Carlton, where with a very sort of blank facade, but the way the carport sits, you think that has an expectant quality, that maybe one day that just gets filled in and it might be a studio or it might be somewhere for someone to occupy. And this has a sort of, in a way, very suburban image, but it's the way this garage door aligns just with the fence here, and then the way the two garages just sit with this space in between, but more importantly even the way this other space beyond sort of almost draws you in a sort of an architectonic sort of way. In Northcote, the use of chain wire mesh that just encloses space so sort of elegantly, and the Salvation Army building in Brunswick Street in Fitzroy that just encloses sort of a space above for use. And in Westgarth, an architect friend of mine, Nigel Bertram, has a lovely way of describing an architectural Darwinism. And I often think about these buildings sort of evincing that sort of quality where over time, you know, what was a shop with this really deep sort of pediment, or rather a parapet here, changes the nature of the building and its connection to the house, and also its connection to the house next door and how it addresses that corner. This building in North Carlton where Italian family came in the 60s and added in a concrete slab through here and just occupies the top, and sort of in a way just once again a very simple brick wall. But what I find particularly engaging is this little window in here that you can imagine that moment in the morning when the sun comes in from the east and then strikes that space inside, and how lovely that must be, and how these little moments create interest and engagement with the space. Melbourne Uni, where a wall just becomes a window here in Tin Alley, and in Northcote where what was a fence becomes a wall with these windows and becomes a space, and suddenly it's sort of the occupation of a different sort of space. This is a lovely little train station at Stony Point, and I think we can all see that lovely quality of this opening, that it draws you into the platform. Or just walking by a building site one day in Fitzroy, and once again that lovely sort of space beyond that's always of greater interest in the foreground. Or during construction, when you reach a certain point in a building where you would like things just to stop, and almost it evinces the quality of the craft of construction. It shows the building in a way that perhaps hadn't been seen, but you can imagine just building a glass enclosure around this and occupying it in a different way. Or during the construction of a project of ours, the Wollomai House at Phillip Island, where you arrive one day and on the roof there's just this lovely opening through here, and that light and shade downstairs that is for me so beautiful, and it gives you something to think, how does that influence other projects or other moments? And at this same project there was a moment when they were breaking up for Christmas before handing over, and the rooftop wasn't yet secured, so the builder was told to just make this secure and not let anybody get up to the roof. So he just clad it all in plywood, and that lovely moment just stayed with me. And then it showed itself in this project that we did called Box, which was for a fashion designer and the unveiling of her new season of clothes, and it became a way to deliver the collection and then show it as well. So things come up, I guess, in different ways. Or back again at Wollomai House, where to create that lovely section through the concrete of a roof light, the builders and the craftsmen have to create that lovely construction, and the craft and the thought that goes into these things. And there's always a slight melancholy from me that all that is somehow lost after it's built, and how do you retain a trace of this, of these moments, of this endeavour? Or the revealing of a lath and plaster wall, and in particular then, once again, where the, in this image, the laths were remained, and then the builder took the plaster off, and I just happened to be there, and there's this wonderful delicate light coming through, and thinking, how can I replicate this sort of light? And they're beginning this sort of idea of trying to use curtains to not only use them as a window furnishing, but use it more as an architectural element, and in a way use it repeatedly. Some would say perhaps a slight obsession with curtains, but I find that they take the glare out of light, and they give the space a wonderful softness. So when you do a lot of residential work, you want houses to feel like a home and not necessarily a studio or a gallery all the time. And then this lovely image of a little shack in New South Wales that, for me, illustrates the very essence of what a home is, or what it is to occupy a space or a room. Or how does a house use utility to just create a space to drive through? Or Phillip Island, the sort of distinct nobility of a shearing shed, the way it just sits beautifully upon a hill. And these sort of, somehow these images sort of permeate and stay with you, I think. And then sort of moments such as art. So I'm particularly interested in the work of Giorgio de Chirico and also the architect, Italian architect Aldo Rossi, where there's always this quietness and in a way a melancholy in the composition that I find really quite beautiful. And this is a Cemetery at Modena by Aldo Rossi, that quietness, that sense of suspension. Or this is a photo of mine that I took in my father's town in about 1988, where there's the cathedral, but there's a sacristy alongside, and to me it was trying to capture that wonderful sense of this courtyard, that inviting quality of space just sitting there beyond the wall. And how do you capture that architecturally? How do you hold that in your hands? And in a way, just as an aside, I like this image because I shot it in black and white, but you know, for me it's sort of interesting when I think about my parents coming here in the 50s, where there could have been a photo from the 50s just as much as it could have been from the 1980s. And growing up, a child of migrants, where there was often the talk about another place, a place that lies beyond, that's there. And my dad in particular would talk about the austerity of these houses, particularly just in the area north of Venice. So these houses that would have a simple interior, but somehow they had this this quality that is at times just outside of the grasp of an architect. I think that these grow out of something else. Or this photo of my parents' house, my father's house here, that there's a directness about these country houses, that it's all about keeping livestock in here, and you walk through these areas to get to the living area. Or, you know, this is very much the land of Giorgione, where in the picture here, the painting of the Tempest, where there's this, in a way, there's an uncertainty, there's an ambiguity that I find really engaging as architectural ideal. And this shot of my grandmother, but in particular, this interior on a hot summer's day, that deep shadow that once again has an ambiguity or an uncertainty about it, that sort of as an architect I find really engaging. So just to talk about a number of these sort of projects. So this is one of the first projects I worked on at Woolamai House, which was the addition to an existing, one of the first houses built at Phillip Island, and the clients were keen to build a separate wing for themselves to live in. So it became a question about how do we create this idea of separation and another sort of separate space. And it was more about a literal extraction, this idea of a a courtyard that allowed light in from different ways, but took away the mass of a building, and that you look through one space, through another opening to another space beyond, and it helps to, I think, sort of create a sort of sense of lightness and a sort of, in a way, an extracted form of plan. And this sort of long corridor that serves as its own space, not just as a linking space, but just as a fallow space that could be used in different ways at different times. This is a project at Park Street House in Fitzroy, which was actually our own house for a long time. I built it with my father, but this was a very small house. The block was actually a car park, and the house itself was only 65 square metres. And in designing it, there was a pervading memory of Baillieu Library, of being in this really sort of lovely double height space in here, and the way this building just turns itself beautifully to the garden to the east. And then perhaps in a less erudite way, this building nearby in Clifton Hill, there was always a certain quality about the way these spaces sort of hang together as a whole. And, you know, a group of flats away, a balcony just turns beautifully back on itself. So this building became one of trying to use some spaces that we borrow from one space to give to another, given the tightness of the space. So, you know, I look at this sort of image, and I remember that very early image of a shop in North Carlton, the sort of direct nature of walking through, study at ground floor level. And then this borrowing of our son's room and our room here, that the corridor actually became, through the use of sliding screens and curtains, it all became one space. It just became divided up at different times in different ways. And at the, even just sitting here at the top of a stair became another place to just sit and view over the park to the north. And a very small kitchen, meals and living space, but importantly, trying to understand the vertical connection so that the space was activated vertically in itself, so that from the bedroom down below there were these moments where the curtain would travel up over 2 levels, and you could sort of get a sense of vertical connection as well as the horizontal. And then trying to create another layer from the street of using a hardened berger here, that with these sort of lovely sort of flowers that became another layer to the building in itself. This is a number of slides for a building I was working on at the same time, which was really a very small project, which was the reworking of an interior foyer to a house in Hawthorne. And we had a very, very tight budget. So here, I guess, in a very literal sense, a very minimal approach of keeping existing windows and using skylights, but in a way that the light became quite diffuse and hidden, so that within the space you would use a natural light of different intensity throughout the day that would actually animate the space in different ways, between a wall in the foreground or a wall in the sort of background of the space. This is a slightly larger house, a very big house in Brighton, and one of the keys in here was to try for me to think, how do we reduce the scale of such a building? And so the idea of creating a deep, long cut into the building, almost like a courtyard, that allowed the connection with the garden beyond, but also in particular views across the building in itself. And that this external space was used as a way that, both discreetly on its own, but a way that linked the rest of the house within it. And in a way, this primary structure or the skin were detached from the interior, so at moments the building would just sort of slightly touch itself in different ways. And use of double height space to create an intensity within the spaces, or then sitting more singularly within here. And at the entry there was quite a progression to make its way into the house, and then these deliberately empty fellow spaces that may get used in different ways at different times. This is a project in Queensbury Street in North Melbourne. It was very much a project about creating an external skin to a space, and remembering back these sorts of images and the sort of engagement with a corner. This building really aligned itself very closely to the Victorian buildings further down this way through here, but also importantly down the lane were the number of old brick factories. So we tried to sort of create this sort of visual connection both one way and back this way as a corner of the street here. And at this point here, with this window that carries up from the study, there's a glimpse of a bell tower across at St Mary's Church across the street. Once again, the use of an internal courtyard, but then at the back corner, the southwest corner, there's deliberate use of hit and miss brickwork, so that from within this space at the upper level where the kitchen meals area is, there's a part of the joinery is actually only like a large door that you can then open up and pick up the cool breezes in the afternoon that come in from the southwest, so that the simplicity of the structure is in a way brought into the building both internally and externally. And at the main sort of living area in here has a number of quite low level windows that engage directly with the laneway adjacent. And this idea of a curtain, as I mentioned before, not just as a window covering, but here as a divider between two different living spaces, or in below here in the client's bedroom, where the space between their bedroom here and the ensuite is really just a curtain, is enough to delineate a notional sense of space and separation. And the use of this, of the hit and miss brickwork that is also used as a layering, so that from the bedrooms at the lower level, so from the street, there's a sort of a thin sort of space that exists between a bedroom and the street, but allows light and air, but a degree of security and separation. This project was a project at Sorrento, where we had a very tightly prescribed planning envelope within which to build, but I was really quite engaged with the idea of the contours through here, and how that the building could sit and not feel as though it were weighted down to this, and to have the sense of the contour liberated from the building, and also retaining these lovely Muna trees and using them as the main aspect for the building. So the building was really thought of as two pavilions that joined very tenderly at one point, and perhaps this is the most telling image of that the garage became less as a utilitarian space to park a car or have a surfboard, but it actually became a space that really evinced the quality of the landscape, and also had a view through to the bay beyond. And this for me is perhaps one of the loveliest spaces in this sort of building. And the way that even the bedrooms upstairs are really just a continuity of an open bedroom to a bathroom to another space beyond. There's a number of just small institutional projects, but this is Seaford Lifesaving Club, which we were lucky enough to win as national competition. This was one of the original sketches for the competition, but it was always an idea of bringing you through from a car park into this public space, and that the building would be more of an envelope than a building proper, and the engagement was with the skyline, with the horizon line of the bay that would draw you through. And this was really an image that was always in my mind at the time, which is a farm complex just outside of Daylesford, and how, for me, what's interesting is this lovely connection of buildings, and it's more the space that exists between these buildings, that the buildings are really quite simple, yet you walk through here and you feel that you're in somewhere special, you're contained, and that these dark spaces are quite inviting for shelter. I mean, beyond their utilitarian use, there's a multifunctionality to them as well. And then there's also the thought of the simple nature of a boathouse, and how this architecture could be more alluding to maybe something that is more like a boathouse than a sort of a building. And most of these maritime markers around the bay are now gone, but this one was not far in near Stony Point, but there's something quite beautiful about the way they sit and the way that they're constructed so simply. So I thought it was worthwhile talking to the plan to this building. So this was really coming from the car park, that there was this general walkway through here, and this was the lifesavers area here with their own amenities, multifunction space for the council, cafe, and public toilets through here. But it was really about creating this public space that was set back to prevent these sort of prevailing winds, but we still get northern light into here. And it was really about the space that was created between the buildings rather than the buildings themselves. And we had a very tight budget, and so we wanted to try to make the building as completely from timber as possible, and anything that would be in steel would be very much off-the-shelf standard connections. But we also wanted to feel that it belonged to the place, that it sat in its foreshore setting. So this is that very public space that you walk through here, and this gathering space between the lifesavers and the multifunction and the cafe through here. And at a tight budget, the lifesavers, kids with surfboards, the interior was all clad in standard construction ply, so that everything was incredibly simple and direct, and that we used just cyclone wire mesh as railings and protective elements leading up here to the observation room. And these screens that sort of lift up through here, and then this just sits there, and memories of some of those buildings sort of from Northcote sort of come to mind through here. The building was designed to be used in many different ways, so simple sliding screens that could divide space for different ways to use a building at different times. And once again, this public way through into here, but also the duality of the space, this sort of way of looking at, I would say, sort of a minimal aesthetic, but within a way that perhaps sort of enriches a use, that creates a sort of a duality, and that detailing is sort of very direct in a building such as this. And that final image that I was really happy with, that you really do read that horizon line almost at the right level as you walk on, and I find when you're there it sort of draws you through. And this is a way taking the idea in minimalism as an idea to an extreme point, I guess. But this is a very small project, but a very dear project to me. It's a primary school shelter in Alphington, and we're working on some school renovations, and the principal asked us if we would consider designing some shelters for the school kids, and they were alluding to sort of these tensile structures, but they had these really, what I found to be quite beautiful, you know, the ubiquitous school shelter shed, that they were going to be demolished, and I thought these are really too lovely to lose. And so the idea was to try to find a way to reuse the building, to validate its very purpose in the schoolyard. And so how do we sort of create a degree of transparency through the building so the children wouldn't feel locked in or in such a linear way? And then a study of the palings. How do we take out every second paling? How do we create a degree of openness and protection to this? And so this is I guess the outcome of just the validation of not only like of a typology that exists, but also just reusing it, and it's still happily used to this day, I'm really happy to say. I'd like to talk about this project, which was the addition to a school in Yarraville, which was in quite a difficult position because you had this train line through here, and there's the Yarraville overpass just to the side here. And the school came to us. It was one of the BER sort of grants, and so a school that was quite impoverished, and we were trying to work out how do we meaningfully use this money, and the school didn't have a drama room even to use, and we thought how wonderful to have this activation of a train line and an overpass here to use it as an area for a drama room. And we really didn't want to demolish anything, so we used what was partially an old ground floor storage room, and we thought, let's build on top of this and think about this building as a way that captures these views back into the schoolyard through here, but engaging also with this overpass. So once again, the building more as a shelter with a very discrete, simple idea about using the surrounding, in a way, attributes to bring some sense of purpose to the room itself. So this is sort of this large window here that picks up the view back to the overpass, and that there's a lovely, at a certain point, transparency through there. So this space here looks back into the playground. Sort of the children particularly love it when they sort of see the train going by, and then the sense of traffic running through here. So it's a very simple space, but it's more of an empty container than a design sort of space. Well, I guess there's some affectation, but you know, it's very much thought of in that way. This next project is an addition to the Ivy building on the corner of Russell Street and Flinders Lane in the city, which we went through quite a long process through VCAT to get this through, and it's to this date not yet built. It's going through a question of with the existing tenants and getting permission to move forward. But it's the memory here was very much, I don't know if you remember that lovely old Coca-Cola sign at St Kilda Junction, which was a really series of little copper discs that would set lightly and would move in the breeze. Sorry for this is the only image I could find of it. I posted It's Sort of Fire from John Gollings gave me this lovely photo. And then it was also, I really find the idea of scaffolding and the mesh and that envelops the scaffolding so wonderfully sort of seductive in the way it sits, and the degree of is it there, is it not there, the sort of temporary quality of it. And so the idea, and well, perhaps just going back to that, but and then one day this image of a city, of a building just wrapped, I imagine perhaps for demolition, perhaps for asbestos removal, but almost sort of kind of Christo-like in the way it sits on the street. And so this project was really restoring the base building, and then a new building on top that was clad with a stainless steel screen that would be loosely moving in the breeze. And so this screen would enclose a very simple sort of office space above. And we did quite a few studies also to examine the quality of light that would be created in there, to make sure that from a comfort point of view that someone working there would sort of feel comfortable in there and not be a glary or overlit space. And as part of the development, we had one of the preferred contractors, we made a 3/4 size model at their warehouse in Barragan and clad it into mesh and studied how lighting would affect it at different times of the day. And so these are photos of the model we submitted to sort of V-cut the way it would sit in this lovely view as you sort of head north along Russell Street. We were engaged by the Good Shepherd sisters at Abbotsford to completely restore their chapel that had fallen into quite a serious state of disrepair. But not only that, to find a way to make it relevant to their use today. And they are very much, as most orders, a dwindling order, and they'd set up quite uniquely a board of trustees to take care of the order once the remaining sisters were no longer here. So they were very, very practical and very direct. And so the idea here really was to look at the existing building and how do we touch the building in the lightest way possible. I really was trying to not leave my mark or my hand on the building, but rather bring it back to sort of the interior and perhaps the sense that remains of the years of dedication of these sisters who had lived sort of lives there. And so we completely restored and faithfully renovated the interior space and very carefully tried to hide lighting and new elements that were required, such that the only objects we really worked on were a series of new interior furnishings, such as a baptismal font or an altar table, or some of these sort of interpretive areas that would talk about the history of the Sisters' Order. And then importantly, they really wanted a secular space for people to gather and not feel that they were necessarily entering into what was a priori a religious space. So there was a quasi-existing little crypt under here. So we used the existing opening and created this new, very quiet space, an area where we could conceal toilets rather than up in the main area, and then created this spot very much for secular gatherings, which is quite widely used now. And that the detailing would be incredibly tight and simple and just create an empty space that could be used in different ways and different times. And even where there were the old vents in the subfloor vents, we've kept those and just created small windows for ventilation through here. And at these viewing moments back into the subfloor structure of the chapel where some of the original nuns who came over from France were buried. So a continuation the presence of the order, but in a very much more secular sort of arrangement. I'll talk briefly about a restaurant, the Stoke House, that we were lucky enough to win in a sort of a competition, a rebuilding of it. And this was once again a very, for me, very simple idea, that it was a very large building, and I was keen to find a way to try to disguise the size of the building. So trying to, in a way, recreate the sense of a primary dune and disguise a lower building within the landscaping, so that this main section would appear to be just sitting above that, with this interstitial space between the two that separated the two blocks, so that this read very deliberately as quite a large empty space. So at different points the building would hopefully not seem as sort of overcoming or overwhelmingly large from the street and from the space itself. And I return importantly here to this image of de Chirico, of the idea of this expectant but quiet space that just seems to sit there in the sunlight. And a project that we worked on, which was a large addition to a large house in Hawthorne. So this was the existing, in a way, Victorian house, but not really. It had been almost demolished by a developer in the 80s and then forced to rebuild part of it by the council. But it had a very strong sense of being a Victorian building to the street, and it was very important for its context. So we were very keen to retain a sense of that to the street, but then create this deep courtyard that brought sort of northern light down into this space, and then arrange more of a living area around this sort of deep courtyard with what we called a cloister around here. So this courtyard had an almost sort of civic quality to it that that borrowed both from the building, the existing building itself, but also had a spatial influence on the building, and in particularly how the way this window in particular is set back in away from the facade, so that it read more like at times a shelter and a skin rather than a building wall in itself. And so these windows in here were very deliberately set back into the large corridor. And so this quite deep cloister then leads you through the window framing into quite a wide corridor gallery, and that all these spaces then find their arrangement around this courtyard, be it sort of the kitchen through here, and also leading into the original part of the house, that they all look onto that space, and then leading upstairs through a very quiet stairwell to these sort of upper levels through here. This next project is, in a way, more of a restoration project to an existing house in North Carlton. And one of the really interesting things about this house was that the floor plan, apart from one opening that had been made in the 50s, had never been altered from its original construction. So it became a very direct, pervading idea that we did not touch any of the existing structure, and where there was a kitchen was returned, where there was a laundry that went back in here, or a bathroom, that none of the existing structure would be altered, and that even this large long garden, rather than opening up with a view through to there, we retained the old doorway that had just a very light literal connection to that space. And so the question about how do you most minimally leave your own mark on a building, so that from within these spaces you use the space beyond to activate and draw you through, and replacement of a kitchen within an existing space, or where there's a doorway reusing old weights for shutters, and even from the back area here where there was the old brick paving, we numbered all of these, put in drainage and replaced the original sort of paving through here, so that there was a scale in which the paving and the brickwork and the house sort of existed. And at this old external toilet, this lovely old vent through here, we retained this and then glazed kept the old brickwork here, and just this little window that opens in through here that is just a very slight moment of how do we leave a trace of perhaps a different way to use an existing element. And then a folding mirror that reflects the scale of that. Or during construction, the revealing of these lovely moments of plaster, that how do we retain a trace of that and not sort of just paint over it, but keep it there as a trace of sort of past colours or a past sort of sense of a wall, so that, very deliberately these sort of lovely, almost Clarice Beckett-like colours sort of sit quite nicely in a room, or, in a bathroom, retain remnants, the remaining sections of an old frieze in a wall, and use of shutters rather than curtains to create a layering to the street. But once again, wherever there was a meaningful remnant, to just leave it there to coexist with the space. And we took this little remnant piece to create a little event for the extraction that sort of works, but is really sort of lovely the way it sits just on the ceiling. And once again, the way very simply these shutters just animate a space. And we found that these original skirting boards and the original doors, that was still the original sort of paint finish, so we just left it. And thinking about this space and my memories of time spent at Newman College, and these lovely elements by Walter Burley Griffin sort of just came to mind, and that rather than building in a wardrobe, just my memory of Newman would be to build a freestanding wardrobe that just sat in the middle of the room, and and then leaving the remnant paint through here, just the sort of patterns that just sit for me sort of quite nicely in the space. And then we had some leftover timber and a steel angle, so we created this little folding mirror just using leftover elements from the building side. This is a much more recent project in Powell Street in South Yarra, and so really what was interesting was the house was a duplex, and the clients wanted to unite the ground and first floor together. So it was a creation of where there was an old bathroom, created an internal staircase. But really, for me, one of the key to the project was very simply to think about an emptiness of space, so that this room in here was giving up to being an empty space, so that it would exist as a fallow space between this living room, this formal living room, and dining kitchen area through here. And then during the design process, sort of memories of this lovely Victorian lampshade that has been sitting in my office for a long time, that I just love the quality of the way it's made and the way the glass is joined through here, and the dissonant quality of looking through different leaves together in different ways. And then slightly obtusely in a way, the Tempietto in Rome by Bramante, the way this wonderful little Tempietto sits in this courtyard, kind of a little bit too large, but with a lovely sort of presence. So it became an idea, a number of these, about sitting in this space here, using the emptiness and creating this dark empty space that existed between two other spaces that leads you through to this more informal area. And this sort of chevron-shaped glass wall with rather interestingly faces north onto a courtyard, but in discussions with the clients, we really wanted to create the courtyard as being something that you needed to go out there to experience. And this obscure glass created a very strong sense of the interior, and that you would walk through that to then enjoy the courtyard. And in this double height void, create this hidden window at an upper level that just picks up the afternoon light from the west. So this window that can't be seen just lights up this deliberately white painted wall here, and getting these sort of lovely shapes throughout the day and shading. And even in the stairwell, the very blank balustrading or stairwell, it's just got a very light fold in here. And that even in this case, the bathroom additions were really seen as just tiled pods within an existing room. And so this sort of quality of the courtyard and the very blank building that just holds a void, so it only holds space in there. And looking through into the kitchen, and the way these chevrons sit were then replicated in the concrete finish at the floor level. And in a way these windows are used, so there were some missing bricks, so rather than putting in an external light fitting, we had the window framer make up a steel frame and became a light fitting within the existing brick wall to the courtyard. So the sort of final couple of images of this space. This penultimate project, I'm just starting with these images that I find really engaging of driving screens. Their sort of blankness and sort of, in a way, the sort of suggestive quality of the way they sit within a space. And then these wonderful sort of concrete structures for the ferry at Sorrento. And so this project was a new house in Armidale, and it was very much about, it's a long sort of thin building, and it was punctured by a series of courtyards to bring northern light into the interior, but trying to think of the building more as a series of sort of volumes rather than one large building. So this is a sort of an entry portico that you walk in, the entry door is set back from the wall, and you have this sort of lovely sort of blank space in here, and entering into a vestibule that is just an empty space that mediates between the overtly public to intensely private space. And then as you walk through that, immediately the sense of the courtyard that exists right in the middle of the building, with a staircase that sort of sits through that space, and then a section from the rear that leads you into this courtyard, so that it has a very strong, meaningful, simple presence of its own, rather than being just some way to bring light and air. It actually has its own sort of presence and view back into the building, such as the stairwell and the kitchen. and then leading down into the basement area with a cellar that has a sunken courtyard in here that this space opens onto, literally with large sliding doors. And how some of the courtyards at the lower level all have these holes in the concrete that allow light and air to come through to windows beyond. And to me, the simple beauty of a concrete wall that's never quite perfect but has its own sort of character. And then the sort of this view of the courtyard from the upper level, where we have a gap between the floor and the windows, so that once again there's a separation of structure from space. More of a utilitarian stairwell leading down to the basement, external bathing room, and then leading through to a very large, simple garage. But we wanted it to have its own presence because this space is used in so many ways, not just to store cars, but an Italian family, so they gather in there. They still each year will slaughter and make salami and prepare the tomato sauce, and they do it all in this space that has its own sort of quality, not just somewhere to store cars. But I'd like to finish on this project, which is only very recently completed, which is, in a way, I think, ties into some of those original sort of catalogue images. So this is in Palmerston Street in Carlton. So the clients wanted to turn this into a home, into a house, but we very deliberately said we want to treat this as lightly as possible, and it's sort of, in a funny way, we use materials such as concrete and steel that in a way sort of paradoxically create the lightness within the structure, because they exist within their own singular element within that space. And we spoke at length with the clients about, well, if you were a migrant arriving in Carlton in the 50s, and I remember working, my father was a bricklayer and a builder, and I grew up with him on a building site, and we worked on a lot of projects in Carlton, and was trying to remember back in those days that you'd walk into these houses and it was like stepping 14,000 kilometres in a step, that it would smell like being in Italy, it would look like that, and not wanting to be quite so literal, but how do we create a directness of architecture and occupation of space? So we, at the upper level, we really wanted to create an internalised terrace. So we took away some of the open space in here and created this semi-concealed internal terrace. So you walk in from the street, and immediately to your right there's a concrete wall that hides a bathroom at the lower level, and a concrete stair that leads you up through this space with these large sort of concrete wall that's very deliberately quite high, and that creates this lower level that is almost like a landing, but enough of a space to actually sit with the northern light coming in, where you might sit and just read before you're led into these very sparse open spaces that lead you through to a living area. And if you look onto this internal terrace and connection through to a dining area through here, but this, once again, empty space with very simple concrete floors that are just left as they were poured, and these very deliberately designed concrete plinths that are used to perhaps sit out or place objects out, but create an idea of occupation within the space, and that are very linked back into this other section of the kitchen, corridor and dining area. And it, once again, use of chain wire mesh with a really tight weave, so that it had a delicacy to the way it sat in the space. And that these sort of slight sideward glimpses into these sort of different spaces. And the use of shutters again to very simply create darkness and separation to the street. And this to me is an important detail of how beautifully the plasterers, we spoke at length with the plasterers of using wet plaster and using old round tools to create this wonderful sort of rounded corners. I mean, I think, Charles, we were saying in the years that architecture has become less about building and wet building with mortar and sand, cement, to an assemblage of prefabricated objects. And I still find great joy in standing there with a plaster and talking through details and finding solutions within the moment. And keeping an old door and a sort of a new rear terrace and just simple ampelite cladding, and then viewing through into this very simple sort of kitchen at the upper level through here, and then viewing back to a corridor, retaining these lovely old, weathered old louver windows and just a very thin, incredibly thin steel framing window that closes and for weather protection and some notional sense of keeping warmth in. And these bedrooms, allowing in a way this lovely corner to just be itself within the room. And then the bathroom itself has a skylight that carries from this above through here all the way to the space down below, and just a simple large sliding pivot door that closes that space, but also just a glimpse of light back into this corridor alone. And then downstairs, the idea of keeping this lovely old garage door that we were keen to not lose the sense of it being a garage, and how access is retained. So at the ground floor level at the front quarter room, deliberately just cleaned the floors, washed them, and left them as they were. And then a front sort of home office, the way that the shelters very simply allow the space to have a different feel at different times, and at this light well that brings light down from below, with sort of very happy with the finish on this simple concrete column, and then this corridor that walks underneath the concrete through into a very sort of thin bathroom space in here and the shower beyond. So we retain simple sort of off-form concrete and these sort of lovely sort of just blue tiles in the space. And then walking back towards what was a 1950s kitchen, which we sort of retained to use as a downstairs kitchen through here, and deliberately didn't want to put new hot plates or anything like that, so just IKEA induction plates, and leading through to the original garage that we wanted to keep. This is another living space to be used, but kept the rawness of the garage in the way this concrete column just carries past the original structure, so that it retained very much the existing concrete floor sense of space, but is just being reused in a new way. Thank you.